in Norfolk, we were miles from the nearest lemon, and we were miles from the nearest anything. And even television was really kind of banned. My father was a scientist, and my mother a historian, and they didn't think much of the television. It was kept in a cupboard and was occasionally taken out for Churchill's funeral when I was about 6 or 7, and for the moon landing and the odd wedding of a member of the Saxe-Coburg family of one kind or another, or the Windsors, as they call themselves now. And otherwise, it was pretty much frowned upon. But my father was away one weekend, and it was raining, so I pulled the television out, and there was a film on it. It had started, so I didn't know what it was. I was about 11, perhaps, and people were speaking in the most extraordinary way. It absolutely grabbed me. I leant for it. It wasn't Shakespeare, but nor was it contemporary, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I remember this young man saying to this young woman, "I hope I will not offend you if I say that you seem to me to be in every way the visible personification of absolute perfection." And it was as if I'd been struck. I'd never heard anybody speaking like that. It was a declaration of love, but it was spoken in such extraordinarily Latinate phrases. And we're sort of brought up to believe, aren't we, that if you love someone, you speak in Anglo-Saxon, "I love you," not "you are the visible personification of absolute perfection." And yet it was somehow beautifully romantic as well as preposterous. Anyway, I carried on watching, and I loved it. And I skipped up to my mother afterwards. I said, Mummy, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection? And she said, "What are you talking about?" And I explained what I'd seen, and I wanted to know what it was. And she said, "Well, that's the importance of being earnest," she said. And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she explained it was a play by someone called Oscar Wilde. Now, being as remote as we were, the Norfolk County Council very kindly, once every other Thursday, sent this grey van deep into the countryside. About a mile from the house, I could stop at the meeting of 2 lanes, and it was a mobile library. So I stopped at the corner and flagged the library down, as you had to do, and the driver got out and went round to the side and opened a side door and lowered some steps and patted my bottom inside in the way that people did in those days. And there was a nice lady in a cardigan with little spectacles on chains and powdery cheeks. And I said, "Do you have something called The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde?" And she said, "Yes, I think we do, my darling." And she pointed me to the book, and it was the 4 comedies, The Woman of No Importance and The Ideal Husband and Lady Vandermeer's Wind and The Importance of Being Earnest. And I took them home and I read them and was absolutely overwhelmed by what I thought it was so brilliant. And I learned The Importance of Being Earnest almost off by heart. I think I still know it. And then I went the following sort of Thursday and said, "Do you have anything more by Oscar Wilde?" And she had the complete works. So I took those home, and some of those were quite difficult for me. There were a lot of political essays, like The Soul of Man Under Socialism and so on, and The Decay of Lying, a lot of aesthetics and philosophy. But there were some short stories and other delightful things. And a couple of weeks later, I took that back and said, "Do you have anything more?" And she said, "Well, you've had the complete works, so that's the complete works." And so I looked round and I saw a book called The Trials of Oscar Wilde. So I said, "Well, I'll take this." She gave me a funny look. She said, "How old are you?" I said, "Oh, I'm old enough to read anything," I said very earnestly. So she stamped it out with a slight air of doubt, you know. And I took it home and I started to read about this extraordinary man, this Irishman who came to London and had a circle around him of admirers and friends, and who changed the way people thought about everything, and who was not only an extraordinary wit, but isn't, I think, as Shakespeare, is it... someone says a Falstaff, not just a wit, but a cause of wit in others. He made everyone around him funnier. He changed the colours of things. He saw things differently. He was wise, and he was so kind. He was such a good friend. And then darkness entered the story, terrible darkness. And he went on trial. There were 3 trials. That's why it was called The Trials of Oscar Wilde. And he was sent to prison for 2 years of hard labour. And as I was reading it, I knew deep inside me that the sin he had committed in Victorian eyes, his nature, as he called it, was something that I shared. And I was frightened. I was thrilled that I had this in common with such a great man, but I was also frightened because I thought, that's my future too, a future of exile and shame and being shunned and hated and spat at and loathed and felt to be unnatural. And that really was a terrifying thing for me. And it settled in my mind this sense that I'd always had, and that I'm sure many of you have had, that I was different from everybody else. And these days, we're so good at compartmentalizing it and calling it identity and so on. And it's a good thing that we can join communities of identity in many ways, but that wasn't available to me, and so I had other ways of responding. And the most important one was then to bicycle into Norwich, which was 12 miles away, and read more and more about Wilde and his circle and other people like that and other artists and other writers. And accidentally on the way, I kind of gave myself a sort of education in literature, just because that's what was available to me, to make me feel that I wasn't alone. And so I felt the burgeoning sense of not only of difference, but also of a kind of rage-filled pride, I suppose you could call it. I felt that I belonged to these people more than to the world around me. Now, at the same time, I was going to school, and I was a troubled soul at school. I'm pretty sure now that I would have been diagnosed as ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I was very, very disruptive, and I was a bad influence. All my reports said he was a bad influence on everyone else. He disrupts the class. He's appalling. He's disgraceful. And I stole things, mad things, screwdrivers from shops and hammers and just weird items and squirreled them away. One of the writers I also admired, who, as it turned out, was an admirer of Wilde, and they met. There's a whole other story that would take 10 minutes to tell, but that was Arthur Conan Doyle, and I always liked Sherlock Holmes stories, and I had done since I was very young. And I had the sort of brain that liked to memorize things, so I knew all the details of the Sherlock Holmes canon, how many steps there were from the pavement to the rooms that Watson and Holmes shared, 17 steps, in case you're interested, and that sort of thing, and the names and genealogies of all the characters. And so I joined the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And anyway, it used to be, whenever I told this story about my time at school, because it was a private school, a public school as they're called, that I used to have to explain the house system. But one of the benefits and advantages of J.K. Rowling is that now everybody knows about the house system in schools. So my house, my Gryffindor, as it were, the housemaster, gave me permission to go to London to attend a meeting of the Sherlock Holmes Society. I was 14 and a half at the time, and I stayed in London. I was supposed to come back the next day, but I stayed for 5 days. I suddenly discovered cinema. So I went in and just watched films and films and films, and found an incredibly cheap hotel room in Russell Square. It was ridiculously dangerous of me, really, as a 14-and-a-half-year-old wandering around London, going into cinemas on my own. But I seemed to get away with it, except that the school, when I eventually got back, decided to get rid of me. And then I was expelled from another school, and then from another school. And I didn't care. I was filled with this peculiar sense of difference and of not connecting to the world around me, and not liking what Kipling called them, the flannelled fool at the wicket and the muddied oafs at the goals. The tribe, the loud, muddy tribe of games-playing, average people that I was simultaneously afraid of and contemptuous of. I knew they were contemptuous of me, and all I could do was be to try and use the lash of my tongue, as it were, to get my own back. I had, for example, if anyone tried to bully me, I had a very good response, which is, no, don't touch me, I'll get an erection. And I can't tell you how well that works. Oh, bloody hell. Oh, Christ. Fucking hell, Fry. Jesus. Anyway, one school after another expelled. Apologies to people who've read my autobiography. They'll know this story. But I found myself in London, and I was getting a bit hard up, and it was a cold evening, and I was in a pub, And so I took a coat from the rack. There was a coat hanging up on a coat stand, or whatever you call them. And I took that, went out, and I discovered it had a wallet in it. It was very exciting. And in the wallet were some credit cards. And what's the word? I went apeshit, that's the word. I went apeshit around Britain spending on these credit cards. In those days, they didn't have magnetic strips and, you didn't swipe them. There was a peculiar... You know how the numbers on the credit card are stand proud of the card, and that's because you used to put them in a little machine and roll it across some carbon paper, and it would imprint on the paper, and that's how you would pay for things. There was no contactless, and there was no swiping. That's the way it worked in those days. So security was absolutely hopeless. So I was staying at the Ritz Hotel, and it was just preposterous. I mean, it was absurd. I was going all over the place, spending money and buying things, and I had 4 suitcases by the end of it. It was ridiculous. And I'd agreed with a school friend that I'd go to the Reading Festival, which is not me at all, but he was a good friend, and he said I'd enjoy it, and that I could, piss in a bottle and throw it on the stage, and all the other things they do. They still do, I believe, at the Reading Festival. And so on my way, I can't remember where I'd been in the West Country, I stopped off at Swindon, and I'd managed to get some very fine suits and shirts and ties and things, but not shoes. So I have size 13.5 feet. And I just hadn't come across a good pair of shoes. So I checked in at this hotel in Swindon and went out to look for some shoes. And I came back wearing a fine pair of shoes that I'd found, feeling very pleased with myself. And I went to my room, and then I went out again to buy a watch. And the clever girl behind the reception desk had seen this young fellow come in. By this time I was 17, by the way. Had seen me come in with bad shoes and then seen me come back with really good shoes. And she thought there was something odd about it. So she took the imprint of the card and called up. And so when I came back the second time, there were 2 men in the hotel room, and I rather stupidly thought they were cleaning it or something. They said, no, it's all right, I don't need it cleaning. And they said, Mr. Gray, which was the name of the person whose credit cards I'd stolen. And I said, yes. They took out their warrant cards, Wiltshire CID, and I was busted. And to cut a very long story a little short, I went to prison. I wasn't sentenced to prison. I went on remand. There were so many pieces of paper flying around 12 different counties of the United Kingdom in which I had committed crimes. So that the police had to assemble all the charges before I could appear in front of the magistrates. So for the first week, I was a non-con, as it was called in this prison. I was not a convict because you're innocent until proved guilty or until you've pled guilty, and I hadn't pled. But after a week, I was sent back up and offered the chance to plead before the paperwork was done. And I pled guilty, knowing that there was no chance of anything else. So then I got into the grey convict's uniform and found myself a prisoner. And this was not how I'd imagined my life turning out in some ways, but in other ways it was exactly how I'd imagined my life turning out. Without any of the romance, without any of the martyrdom or the sacrifice, I had turned myself into Oscar Wilde by being imprisoned. But it was a pretty squalid and not very impressive piece of transgression that had got me there. So picture me, I'm going to exaggerate, but there I am, lying on the stone flags of the cell. The shadows of the cell bars are struck across, athwart my back. A rat scurries over me. I sob into the straw. And I vow to myself that this is as low as I'm going to get, and that I shall go to Cambridge. And now, why Cambridge? What is it about this place that was particularly appealing to me? Well, I was an East Anglian, so I suppose it was the nearest fine university, with all respect to UEA. No, a fine place. Yeah. But also because I had in this journey, I'd fallen in love with a particular strand of literature, which nowadays it is admired, but perhaps it's not as respected as it was once. And that is the tradition of E.M. Forster and Bertrand Russell and the Bloomsbury Group and so on, which was based on a sort of philosophical idea of G.E. Moore, who was a Cambridge philosopher, and Bertrand Russell, who was a Cambridge philosopher, of course, and that was something to do with the sanctity of human relations, is the way they put it. The glory of connection between friends, and how that was more important than anything else. E.M. Forster had written a famous line in one of his essays, in which he had said, he was talking, this was later on, he was talking about, I think, in particular, the Cambridge spies. This was in the 60s, Maclean, Burgess, Philby, the ones who worked for Russia a lot during the Second World War and then afterwards. And he said, if it came to a choice between betraying my friend or betraying my country, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. And a lot of people thought this was the worst thing they had ever heard, that it was a treachery even to write it, that I would have the guts to betray my country rather than my friends. But they always forget how he carried on that sentence. He said, I know a lot of people, he said, will be reaching for the telephone to contact the police when they read this. But I would urge them to remember that I have Dante and others on my side. In the seventh circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, you may remember, the absolute central core of the worst of the worst of the worst were Judas Iscariot and Brutus, who both betrayed their friend. So as he put it, that's the tradition we really come from. That is ultimately something worth remembering. The sanctity of human relations is the phrase used. And something in that whole way of thinking and being, which can easily be looked at as kind of mimsy and sentimental and self-indulgent and all kinds of other things, it really appealed to me. And I loved the idea of the poets who had been here, the Tennyson and Milton and Wordsworth and Byron. And I loved Bertrand Russell and G. Moore and Forster. And that whole sort of idea struck me as being so lyrical and beautiful. And of course, at the center of Forster's worldview was tolerance, was a tolerance of other people's ideas and a tolerance of other people's thinking and a tolerance of other people's natures, including, of course, sexuality. He was a gay man who never really came out except to his own friends, and the gay literature he wrote was only published posthumously. Anyway, so there I am, as I say, on the prison floor, and I'm thinking about this place and imagining it, and I'm seeing King's Chapel, and I'm seeing the sun hitting the stones, and it's utterly sentimental, and I'm sort of sobbing to myself, thinking, how am I going to get there? I don't know how I'm going to get there. But it is a kind of full circle, because my sexuality and my knowledge of how alien it was to others had forced me to read and to find solace and friendship in dead writers and writers from all over the world and the characters they created, to find vindication as well. That was such a powerful thing. And I thought, well, I'm going to see if I can get in. So I had to wait for my prison, for my magistrate's appearance. And I was fortunate because I'd been so long on remand. This was counted as part of a custodial sentence. So I was, in fact, only given 2 years probation. So I went home, my parents had come to pick me up, and there was a rather silent and solemn journey from the West Country all the way back to Norfolk. And they said, well, you can live with us, they said, but we're not going to pay for you to go to any more schools or anything like that. I said, no, that's fine. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a job, and I'm going to see if I can get into a college somewhere in Norwich. And I went to, the very next day, I got home, I mopeded my way to Norwich, where there was a city college, and it was the registration day. It was an unbelievable coincidence, it was the second registration day and the last, and I was at the back of the queue, and I got there, and there was this fellow who said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to do A-levels in English, French, history, and the history of art." And he said, "Well, you can only do 3." And I said, "Well, English definitely, and any of the others." He said, "Well, English is full. We've got 2 English sets, and they're both full." So I said to him, "If you let me read English, I will get a scholarship to Cambridge." He said, "We don't do the Cambridge entrance exam." It was a separate entrance exam. And I said, "Nonetheless, I will train myself to do it, and you will be proud of me." And he looked at me. His name was Peter Butler. We became friends, and he gave me a long look. I looked back at him, trembling inside, and it seemed to be like a minute. And then he went, "I suppose so." And he'd signed a piece of paper, and I was in. So, of course, then I had to try and make good. And it was this 1-year course in A-levels, and I fortunately did them and did get a scholarship to Queen's College and arrived on probation. And every now and again, I had to get a train to Norwich to see my probation officer during my first year. And when that was over, just towards the end of my first year, I went to my director of studies and I said, "Can I buy you a drink, Dr. Holland?" He said, "What?" I said, "Well, I want to celebrate with you because I've just come off probation." He said, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, I've been on probation for, I was convicted of a crime and I've been on..." He said, well, why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Well, I'm telling you now, and you never asked." You fill in a form, and one of the questions is noticeably isn't, "Are you on probation?" So anyway, that was my time, and it did turn me around. I did all the things that you could do then, which were much smaller than what you could do now. But I joined the Gay Society, and I was out, and I made friends, and those are still the friends I have. 40 years later, more than 40. Oh, God, it is 40 years, yeah. That's what I think of when I come here. I mean, it's very self-indulgent to tell you this story, but for me, it is a story about one of the things a place like this can offer. It offers not just the friendship and the excitement and the joy of youth and self-discovery and making mistakes and being silly and laughing with your friends, laughing and laughing and laughing with your friends and finding out new passions and so on. But it's also an idea in your head. And I'm never afraid to be sentimental about the idea of Cambridge. The reality of it is always, of course, disappointing. But the platonic, the reality of everything is disappointing in the sense that, the actual nuts and bolts and the bricks and so on are not quite as perfect as they are in your dream. But there is a platonic form, if you like, of Cambridge that one can carry in one's head. And then there is a Cambridge one can improve. That, by being here, one makes it better. And so I suppose if I had a message for you, it is don't mold yourself in the form of Cambridge. Mold Cambridge in your form. Make it yours. The stones seem to be very hard, but actually every time I come back here, I realize that it isn't the same Cambridge that I was in, despite the continuity of the architecture and the portraits in the walls and everything else. It is yours. You have a totally different experience to the one I had. But the past, one hopes, will inform it and make you happy. But I've probably spoken for long enough on my own, and I welcome now any questions you may ask on any subject. But thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Are we going... We're going for the keenest hand, possibly of all time, over here. It's prepared.
It's prepared, yes.
Thank you for a most interesting introduction for the evening. This is about myths, if I may ask. You've said in the past that myths arrive from the collective unconscious. If so, given humanity's precarious circumstances, might this collective unconscious give rise to a new myth for us today? Should we stay open to this possibility, or is the matrix the final word?
Well, yes, it's very kind of you to say I've called it the collective unconscious. I was quoting Carl Jung, who called myths a collective unconscious. And Joseph Campbell, I think, called them public dreams. And myths are something that interests me. I'm always fascinated by ways you can explain things. And again, a university is a perfect example because the departments of university are, if you like, little packets of explanation. So there is a Natsky explanation of the world. There's an empirical scientific explanation of how things were, where everything came from, a big bang, and so on. And it's a very convincing one. And it's one that differs from theology or myths in that theology and myths don't make machines work. You can't build a light bulb, a physical light bulb, out of an understanding of myth. But you can out of an understanding of electrons. So, thanks to Faraday and Maxwell, you can have a light bulb, and Edison and Swan and so on. But with myths, what is it you're building? It's another way of looking at the truth. So, for example, the Greek myths have a big bang as well. It was chaos. They called it chaos, and out of chaos came these elemental forms, light, ether, as the Greeks called it, and so on. And I think of our ancestors, probably very inaccurately, in caves. And there was a period when, thanks to behavioral modernism, I think paleontologists call it, we were building tools and we were developing language. And we were starting to harness the power of nature in our own way. So the agricultural revolution and everything, it all came together in such a way that we were having enough calories to give ourselves a little bit of leisure. And so people were starting to ask questions. Because in the past, almost like most animals, we were too busy running away from nasty animals and running towards animals we wanted to eat and traveling to places that were safer and warmer. We just didn't have time for anything else. But suddenly we had this time and so I picture children in caves, saying, Mummy, Daddy, why do flowers push out of trees? What makes them do that? And when there's a force and you can't explain it, it's really a God until you can explain it, a force that moves things. And it could be the fire that comes out of mountains, or it could be the roar in the sky that precedes a rainstorm. All these extraordinary things that our ancestors could not possibly explain. You had to find a way of explaining it. And that's what myth allows you to do. It allows you to say, well, we'll give them a name. There's Demeter pushes the flowers out of the trees. And that's what she does. And she makes the grass grow up and then they'll say, but why do the leaves fall off the trees then? And so then you make up a story of why maybe Demeter was unhappy. And so in the Greek case of Demeter and Persephone, a myth is born. And it's a beautiful explanation. It's saying there is a happiness and a joy in growth, and then there's a sorrow in the lack of growth. And it's a powerful metaphor that makes enormous sense, I think. And then it gets more sophisticated as we get more sophisticated. And suddenly it's peopled. And the world of myth is full of characters who exhibit behaviors that can be very close to our own, like flying too close to the sun, or whatever it might be. And that's thrilling. But in terms of our own history, the moment you consciously try and construct a myth, it's not a myth. It's a novel, or it's a poem, or it's a play, it's a story, it's a parable, but it's not a myth. A myth has no author, but some deep race memory that is passed on, I think. So it's a very dull answer to your question, but I don't know that we can have a modern myth in quite that way. I think we've replaced myth-making. Yeah?
Do you have any questions that were thought of in the last half hour? In particular, there's one there in the red scarf. If you get a microphone, all down there.
What has been the highlight of your life so far?
Oh my goodness. Heavens. Walking into this chamber to such a warm round of applause is clearly, what could beat that? I mean, really. Well, I suppose I could be gooey and truthful. Again, it sounds a bit sort of special pleading and narcissistic almost. But yeah, everything I told you about my early life, the idea that 6 years ago I could marry the man I love, and there I am now, nearly 7 years married. I mean, that's pretty wonderful, and I've got to hold that as probably the highlight. In terms of work, well, I don't know. I mean, that Oscar Wilde character, whom I so fell in love with as a youth, again, the idea that I would ever play him, which I did in a film, which was a real thrill, extraordinary. That was in 93, 4, something like that. And we had, as a consultant on the film, Merlin Holland, who is Oscar Wilde's grandson. So there on the set, I would sort of, give a hug and shake the hand with the DNA of Oscar in it. And that was astonishing. And a little later, 95, I guess it must have been, they consecrated a window to Oscar in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner, above Robert Browning and John Keats and Shelley and all the greats who were there, Shakespeare and so on. There was a window to Oscar Wilde. But the thing that was so extraordinary, there were all British literary establishment was there, and Irish, naturally, because Oscar was an Irishman. So there was Seamus Heaney, there was Tom Stoppard, Harold Pinter, people like that. But most remarkably, Merlin, arm in arm with the current Marquis of Queensberry, walking up the aisle. Now, it was the Marquis of Queensberry who destroyed Wilde, because the Marquis of Queensberry's son, Lord Alfred Douglas, was Wilde's lover, and the Marquis of Queensberry couldn't bear it, and so caused the circumstances that brought about Wilde's trial. So 100 years, almost to the day after Wilde's arrest, there was this rapprochement. And I felt at that point, in 95, that everything was coming together. The Berlin Wall had fallen a few years earlier. Nelson Mandela had walked free from Robben Island. These kind of moments of acceptance for gay people, I really felt in my heart that the world was knitting together, and that all the differences and all the enmities and all the tribal resentments and dislikes, all the horrors of racism and intolerance and bigotry were melting away. And what was going to help it most of all was something that a year before had been invented by Tim Berners-Lee in Switzerland, that he called the World Wide Web. And that with the World Wide Web and other elements of the internet, email, and all these blogs that were beginning to happen, this was going to bring us all closer and closer together. And I think of myself in that, watching that rapprochement and thinking of how it was all going to be wonderful. And I now look at that fucking naive idiot thinking, how did he misjudge the human race so badly? How did I think that it was all going to work? And then another part thinks, well, why didn't it? Everything was right. Everything was pointing in the right direction towards this knitting up, this connection. And instead of a centrifugal hug, we got a centripetal throwing out and everybody separating. And it still makes me weep to this day. But I am an optimist, and we will knit together, but not yet, sadly.
We will go... no one upstairs but the hand up. Okay. I shouldn't have said that because I invited more hands. Could we go to the person there towards the back? Yes.
That was exciting. You talked a lot about laughing at university. Can you tell us about one of the funniest moments that you had during your time at Cambridge?
Well, my first about halfway through my first term, I went to see a play at the ADC, Tom Stoppard's Travesties. And it was very good. It was very well directed, I thought. But there was one woman in it who was so brilliant. I was caught completely by surprise and fell kind of in love with her talent. I just couldn't believe how extraordinary she was. And she was the same age as the rest of us, but she just was in talent beyond belief. And the very next day was the first day of a seminar on The Winter's Tale that I had to go to. And I found myself sitting next to this girl. So I introduced myself and I said, I think you're the most remarkable actress I've seen, not just at this university so far, but just about anywhere. And she said, oh, thank you. Her name was Emma Thompson. And we became extremely close friends. And she liked something about my manner and badgered me to go to auditions and see, and act myself. So by my second term, I was in 7 plays, I think. And then I wrote a play for Edinburgh, and it was a comedy, as it happened. And it won this award. It was for the Mummers. And Emma came to see it with this friend of hers. And she said, I think you two should get on. I said, hello. And he said, hello. He said his name was Hugh. And I didn't really think much more about it. And then at the beginning of the next year, Em came round to my rooms and she said, I'm going to take you around to see Hugh again. I said, who? She said, you remember I introduced you to him in Edinburgh? I said, no, I don't remember. He said, well, he's the president of Footlights now, and he needs someone someone else to come in and write. There's him and there's me, and maybe you might like to join the Footlights. Now, as I was saying to someone earlier on, it is an absolute rule at Cambridge that everybody says, apparently the Footlights are really crap this year. I mean, it's absolutely inevitable that people will say that. And so, of course, I not being in the Footlights, I'd sort of heard, apparently the Footlights are crap this year. So I thought, do I want to be involved in the Footlights? I'm an actor. I do plays. Well, I did plays. The fact is, being tall and rather pompous and with a dark, deep voice in a university where everybody's age 20, I naturally always played the king or the ruler, sometimes a warty old fool who comes on and blesses the lovers in Act 5, and sometimes quite a good part. But I thought that was my métier, to be an actor. And I liked comedy, but I thought the Footlights was, a bit crap. So anyway, she dragged me over to Selwyn College and knocked on the door, and the door opened, and there was Hugh sitting on the bed, and his girlfriend was making a cup of coffee. And he had a guitar on his lap. And he said, hello, again. And I said, hello. I didn't really remember him particularly. But anyway, he said, I'm writing a song. And he played a verse of the song. And I sat down next to him, and I said, that's brilliant. He said, yeah, well, I can't write anymore. I can't think of how it goes. So we just started to talk about the lyrics of it, and we finished it. And then we took out a pad of A4 and we started to write a sketch. And then another one. And Em and Katie, Hugh's girlfriend, were sort of sitting there chatting away and staring at us thinking, what are you two doing? They said, well, we've just written 2 sketches and a song. He said, but you haven't even had a cup of coffee, Steve. You just sat on the bed. And it was the most extraordinary thing that happened to me, really. It was falling in love, not in a sexual way, but in a comedic way. We just boing like that. We just completely fitted. We had the same sense of humor. And it was just magical, absolutely magical. That every day we would see each other and we would write things and we would laugh. We would love it. I mean, it's not a funny thing to have happened, but it's a thing that is around the subject of funniness, I suppose. And that was, I don't know how it could have happened. If I hadn't gone to prison, I would have been, because I was a year older than everyone else because of my prison time, so I probably wouldn't have met him, but having met him, and and funnily enough, when we did our Footlights show, we went to Edinburgh, and then one of the evenings, we were taking the bow, and the audience went completely nuts. And they'd given us a nice round of applause, and the show was, reasonably successful. Apparently the Footlights are not that crap this year. And so we were sort of doing all right. And we noticed suddenly that there was someone coming on stage behind us. And he was a very famous person. He'd just become very famous. It was Rowan Atkinson. And he, and he was carrying this sort of object. And we thought, what the hell's this? And we knew he was famous because of this TV show called Not 9 O'Clock News, which he was on. And he came forward and said, I am Bob. And announced that we'd won this award called the Perrier Award, which is, and it was the first time it ever been awarded. So he handed it to us, and we thought, wow, that's exciting, because it involved performing in London at a London theatre. And then the next night, a BBC producer came to the show and came round afterwards and said, we'd like to put this on BBC Two. We said, no, but this is just a student show. He said, yes, but we think we'd like to put it on. So we go, wow. And then the next night, bonkers, an ITV producer came and said, we'd like you to do a series. We thought, this is just extraordinary. What's going on? And then the next night, an Australian promoter came on and said, I'd like to take you around Australia. So we did that first. We went round Australia, came back and recorded a show for the BBC, and then went off. And the ITV show, they wanted to combine traditional sketch comedy of the Cambridge kind, which was me and Hugh and Emma, and with a new, and so they found this fellow who just graduated from Manchester, Ben Elton, and someone who'd graduated from the Art College in Scotland, Robbie Coltrane. So we did a series together. And it's just extraordinary that this happened. I mean, there was no explanation for it. It was a kind of piece of luck within 4 nights of doing this show in Edinburgh, of having our lives completely transformed. And I'm fully aware that telling that story, people are going to be very, very angry and say, you fucking lucky bastard. How did that happen? And I don't know how it happened. All I can think is that something about the 3 of us, when together, gave people a nice feeling. Because I honestly don't think that we were cosmically funnier than anybody else, I certainly wasn't better looking than anyone else. It just was an incredible piece of good fortune. So when people write letters, which they often do, and say, do you have any advice as to how to get into comedy? What can I say? I say, well, be like me, just have a good fairy on your shoulder who opens doors for you. I've been extraordinarily lucky, but the luck was the connection with other people. So if there is a theme this evening, it is in connections with other people. I don't think on my own, I can't imagine having gone forward in such a happy and lucky way, but by these friendships and these connections. So that's my experience with the Footlights, which is pretty amazing, really.
Do you ever wonder how your life would have panned out if you hadn't met Hugh and Emma? Yeah,
we talked about Hugh. Hugh wanted to be a member of the Hong Kong police force. It's really weird. He'd read a story that there was corruption in the Hong Kong police force, and he wanted to go in and clean up the Hong Kong. And then I pointed out he'd have to wear ironed white shorts, which the Hong Kong police force did wear, and that slightly put him off it. But I honestly thought I would either stay here and grow tweed quietly in a corner and adopt a pipe and teach, or in a school, because that's what I always imagined I'd do, is teach. And yeah, I'd hope to write books in the holidays, as all teachers do, and very few manage to do, because it's a much busier job than just thinking it's only term time implies. But how can one know? It is an extraordinary thing. And you, all of you, in 5 or 10 years' time, you'll be thinking, I never thought I'd end up here. And it's exciting and terrifying at the same time, isn't it? You can never know. The contingency of fate is endlessly remarkable. I mean, I'll give you an example of I was in New York 15 years ago or so, and a friend of a very good friend of mine, we were chatting away, and he suddenly said, do you know, if my mom had better taste in shirts, I wouldn't be here. I said, what are you talking about? That's a fascinating way to begin a conversation. Turned out it was his birthday, and his mother gave him a shirt, Brooks Brothers shirt, and he didn't like it. He thought it was awful. So the next morning on his way to work, instead of going straight to work on his train, he stopped off to get to 46th Street, where Brooks Brothers is, and change it, because he kept it in its packet. And he had to hang around a bit. It was he was really annoyed. I'm going to be late for work. Eventually got the shirt changed and was just walking out, and everybody was behaving strangely and clustering round shop windows looking at television screens. And an aeroplane had charged into the building where his office was. And he would have been there had his mother not had such a terrible taste in shirts. Now, there are thousands of stories like that. Every time you leave the house, as it were, you might, if you'd left 5 minutes later, you might have been driving along and run over a child. And people do, they're driving along and the child runs out between two cars, and all they can think of is, if I had taken 3 minutes longer to say goodbye to the children before getting in the car, or if I had left quicker and not been delayed, it drives you insane to think how contingent life is. And it's a whole other subject, and I dare say a good one for a debate if you haven't already done it, the question of free will, as you probably know. There are very few philosophers in the world who believe there is such a thing as free will, but all of us kind of behave as if there is such a thing as free will. But if we think very hard about it, there clearly isn't. And these contingencies of cause and effect are so... We would drive ourselves mad if we tried to work out how things happen. But it's amazing how often we congratulate ourselves on things that are good, as if it is our skill and brilliance. I mean, like my luck with comedy, it's incredible good fortune. Or tomorrow there may be incredible ill fortune, and I don't know what the answer is. I think it's not worth worrying about whether or not we have free will, even though it is the biggest question in the world. You just have to behave as if we have it, don't we? Anyway, sorry, it's a whole other thing.
Does sound like a good debate mission.
Yeah.
Right, we will go up to the rafters now. We go to the person at the back by the blind. Do we have mics upstairs? Oh, yes, we do. Okay.
Brilliant. I'll tell you, just, you were talking about amusing things. There are, perhaps not as many as now as there used to be, amusing dons, fellows of colleges. There was one at, I think at St. John's, I can't remember his name, I think it was Crooks, I think his name was. And in those days, colleges were locked at, 10:30 or 11. And obviously people like to get out of the colleges to drink and see people and, so you had to find clever ways to get back into the college. And in St. John's, one of the ways back in was through the Master's Lodge window. And this fellow had been out at night. It was about 2 a.m, and he goes in through the window of the Master's Lodge, and he's just creeping along through the study of the Master's study, which is what the window is. And there's a light suddenly under the door. There's a yellow strip of light. He thinks, shit. And so he hides under the desk like that, thinking, and the door opens, and footsteps and a creak. Someone sits in the chair at the desk and he sees his feet, slippered feet, the sort of bare, shiny old man shins. And he's there as quiet as possible. And then he hears a page being turned in a book. And he thinks, oh, God, he's reading. And then another page. And then after an hour and a half of getting total cramp, the book is slammed. And he hears the master's voice saying, well, I don't know about you, Wiggins, but I'm going to bed. Sorry.
It was really fascinating and heartwarming to hear you speak about the importance of connection and belonging, and also about using being in such a dark space to propel yourself really into a place of such brilliance. During the lockdown, after a discussion with my best friend Charlie, we established a group on Facebook, controversially called Lads Advice, and it targets young men who might find it difficult for various reasons to access mental health support. And so the question that I wanted to ask you is if you have a message, or what would you say to young men who are finding themselves, due to those social structures that make it difficult to access support, what would you say to them about what they should do? And as a bit of a more self-indulgent second part to the question, you're rather loved within the group, so we have a small gift for you, and I'm lucky enough to be sat next to some of your scholarship recipients who are going to, I believe, meet you. So if it's okay with you, can I send that with them?
Thank you very much. That's very sweet of you. The mental health question is a very important one, and it's fortunately one that is being talked about far more than it ever used to be. I had a rather terrible experience in the early 90s when I was in a play in the West End, and I had some sort of storm inside me that propelled me away from the play and into a car and into Europe, and I just simply ran away. I did actually try and end my life. I sort of started the car in a lock-up garage and thinking that was supposed to end your life. But after about half an hour, it didn't seem to make any difference with the window open. And so I drove to Europe and through Belgium into Holland and Germany. And I had some strange idea that I would go up north of Germany into Denmark, maybe somewhere at the top of Jutland, and buy a big, thick white pullover and a pipe and sit on a rock and write poems and, learn Danish and just hide away from the world, because I couldn't face the world and I couldn't face myself, and I couldn't understand why I was so unhappy. I was, on the surface, a very successful person, a very fortunate person. I was quite prosperous and I had friends and I was loved, and I couldn't understand it. But inside I was utterly, utterly desolated with misery and self-hatred. There's no other way of putting it. And it was an awful thing. And I eventually came back. And in fact, Hugh, it was there was before he wasn't on email, but he knew that I loved all this thing. And there was something called CompuServe that I was a member of. And he managed to get a message through to me to tell me to come home and to ring him and so on. And it was... Anyway, I came back and I saw people and I got a diagnosis, which was called bipolar disorder. And the weird thing is that I'd heard that phrase before and I couldn't quite remember where. It used to be called manic depression, and it was called manic depression because it has two sides, mania and depression. So an elevated state and a depressed state, and you swing between them. Hence also bipolar, two poles. A pole of elevation and a pole of depression. And I was put on medication, and I also went to see a psychotherapist, and a friend lent me a house in the south of France, and I could be away from the public gaze because it did cause quite a stir. And I slowly recovered myself, I think, a little, at least enough to feel more confident. And the producer asked if I would make a program about it. He said, do you want, it's a program in which you find out more about this condition yourself, how prevalent it is, how it's dealt with, how, and so on. And I thought long and hard about it. A part of me didn't want to scratch the scab, cause it to bleed again. Another part thought, I don't understand this enough. So I agreed to do it. So we made this documentary called The Secret Life of the Manic Depressive. And I saw a lot of people, a great many people, who have this condition, this bipolar disorder. Interestingly, I asked each of them, it's a classic sort of philosopher question you ask in Philosophy 101, there's a button, and ethicists use the button. The usual question is, if you could press the button, you'd get rid of all the misery, bullying, unkindness, and horror in the world, but you'd also get rid of all the creativity and all the joy and all the love, but it would just be bland, Would you press the button? And of course, there is no right answer, but most people wouldn't. So I did a bipolar equivalent. I said to these people who all suffered terribly from this condition, I said, here's a button. If you press it, you will never have a depressed state again. You will never have that misery, that sense of being closed off, that sense of not wanting to come into contact with other people and not believing in any future, having no sense of the future except as a black wall. But you will also never experience the elevated mania in which you planned all your plans for the future, incredibly exciting. You're exuberant and grandiose and filled with energy and filled with a kind of fire, sometimes a very dangerous fire, a kind of radiant feeling. I've had states of it where I've felt like Joan of Arc, really bizarre feelings like that. But anyway, they are enriching and thrilling sometimes. And I said, so you can press that button, you don't get either. And only one person wanted to press the button out of the dozens that I spoke to. And that was a woman who'd taken a drill to her head to try and empty it of the pain she felt. And pain is an important word when you're dealing with serious mental illness. There was a wonderful man in the film, who had been a naval officer, and he had been the captain of the Royal Yacht Britannia for a while, and then he started to have really quite severe episodes of mental illness of the bipolar nature, and he had to be fired from that job and from the Navy, and he was in a hospital, and he was in a locked ward, but not a very heavily secure one, and he escaped from it because he wanted to end his life, and he ran out in front of a lorry, and his legs were smashed. And he rolled his trouser legs up on camera and showed me they had been broken and rebroken and rebroken by the surgeons, in order to straighten them. And he looked over my shoulder into the camera lens and said, "What I want everyone watching to understand," he said, "is that the pain, the unbelievable pain in my legs for 2.5 years as they smashed them with hammers and reset them, was absolutely nothing compared to the pain in my head from my depression. They have to understand that." And that was very powerful testimony. And the thing I say when, I am honored to be the president of Mind, the mental health charity, the largest of the mental health charities in Britain. And you have to hold two things in your head. One is that this is a very serious condition. It has what doctors call a very high level of morbidity. You really can slide out of the human world. You self-medicate. If you've not been diagnosed and your mood's changed, the first thing you reach for is alcohol or narcotics or speed or coke or whatever it is, just so that you can somehow control these moods that otherwise are uncontrollable. It's called self-medication in the trade, and it sounds like you're being, he's just an excuse for being a lush, but it's not that. It is a desperate attempt to not feel like you're feeling. And you slide, therefore, down out of a job and out of your family, and you're on the street. And then a lot of people get into that terrible position, and they have a shorter life than they ever would otherwise. And of course, there's self-harm, and there is the ultimate self-harm of suicide. So that is one thing you have to remember, that it is a very serious, or potentially very serious condition, something like that. But the other thing to hold in your hand is that there are millions of people who have that condition in one form or another around the world, who are capable of living full and fulfilled lives full of love and creativity and success and happiness and connection, that it can be managed and lived with in the same way that diabetes or asthma can be lived with. They're chronic conditions, it's sort of with you always, but there are ways you learn to cope. And it can be a medical intervention, or it can be CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It can be a number of different things. And there are, as we know now, great mindfulness techniques and the understanding of exercise and fresh air and walking. It sounds kind of like the old oh, go and walk it off. But it isn't. There are real ways of connecting with nature and with other people and with music and all kinds of things that are more available now than used to be and more understood. And so that's a very helpful thing. Now, on top of that, I'm talking there about very clear conditions that I suspect one day will be very easy to diagnose with fMRI scanning or with genetic sequencing. It's a real condition, just as so is atrial fibrillation or pancreatic cancer. But then there are other things on the spectrum of mental disorder, which we're very much aware of at the moment, which seem to be a result of mixtures of things, including the pandemic and lockdown and the pressures of finance and so on, particularly amongst the young, amongst people like you. And these are called mental health conditions. They're not quite as diagnosable as something like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or a mood disorder like bipolar, but their anxiety and their stress and their misery and their an uncontrolled sense of not being right. You know what I mean? So in the same way that you can have an illness, a physical illness that really is a cancer or a dangerous heart condition, but you can also have a real pain in your leg that makes it impossible to walk. They're both serious, but they're very different kinds of thing, aren't they? And I suppose the one we're most aware of at the moment is this mental health one. And there are people who are very cynical about it and think people use it as an excuse. So, someone is accused of something and they immediately are not available for comment because they have mental health issues. And you think, oh, they're just hiding behind it. But we don't know that. We can't be sure. There are people now who I think rightly make a good case for saying that the misery, the anxiety, the stress, the unhappiness, the feeling of not belonging that is so common amongst so many of us is one of the most urgent crises that we have to think about. And yes, you can reach out to mindfulness apps, you can reach out to your GP, you can reach out to various techniques that you discover and read about, but also you can talk to your friends. Remember, if you're a friend and you have another friend who is deeply unhappy, if they don't tell you about it, it's very upsetting for you. We want to be used as friends. We want to help others. So don't ever be afraid and think, I call it the genital wart syndrome. If you suddenly notice, oh my God, what's that doing there? It's a weird human psychological thing that we're perfectly happy to show it to a stranger, a doctor we've never met before. Will you look at this? Is it all right? But the idea of showing it to your mother or a friend, say, will you look at my old fella and see what this wart is? They go, fuck off. But they wouldn't, or at least we think they would. But in the case of mental health, it's really important to overcome that. So I suppose, it's not a full answer. It's impossible to give a really full answer. But again, use friendship. Not use it in the sense of exploit it, but the gift of friendship is something that is incredibly important, I think, in helping one with those conditions. That's what I'd say.
I reckon we've probably got time for two more.
Bloody long, aren't they?
Two more, maybe short-ish questions. We'll go to the person there on the end of the row.
It's quite a short question. Do you think Dean Smith can save Norwich this season?
Well, as my Jewish grandfather used to say, from your lips to God's ears. Norwich City are in the cellar, but we've just gone up one floor above Newcastle, rather. It's been Newcastle, Arabia. I'm optimistic, but cautiously optimistic. History has shown that we are the absolute embodiment of a yo-yo club. Let's be honest.
We'll do two more questions. There's someone, again, very enthusiastic on the front row here, so I feel we probably owe it.
Yes, hello, I'll try to be quick. I basically just wanted to thank you because I'm from the middle of nowhere in Hungary, and I didn't speak English, and I've didn't belong because I suspected I wasn't straight or a woman. And I happened upon your book by complete chance, and I found out about this place called Cambridge, and I taught myself English and said I would make it here. And the fact that you're here tonight and I can actually see you is, I've already cried. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wow. We should be pussy paitash. I hope I got that right. My grandfather used to use that word. It means a kissing friend. You know, Hungarians are very demonstrative and affectionate. And so men or women, if they have a friend, will kiss them in the street, like that. So I'd say to and the word for someone you know well enough to kiss in the street is pussy paitash. And at least that's how I remember it, my grandfather saying it. So you'd say to him, do you know so-and-so? He'd go, yeah, we're not exactly pussy paitash, he would say. And he used to say, your accent is amazing. He used to drive through, he used to say things about Hungarian Jews. He used to say, a Hungarian Jew is the only man who can follow someone into a revolving door and come out first. But he used to drive me mad. We'd drive in the countryside and he'd look around and say, what a wonderful village. I go, Granddaddy, you can say what and you can say village. Why can't you say what a wonderful village? What a wonderful village. No, what a wonderful village. What a wonderful village. Anyway, yours is much better than that. And I'm sorry about Viktor Orban.
I think we'll still do 2 more questions. I want 2 real questions. We'll go at the front here, and then we'll do 1 more.
What's the biggest difference you've noticed between Cambridge when you were a student to now?
That's an interesting question. What is the biggest difference? You're much prettier, all of you. It's hard for me to say. I haven't, penetrated the membrane of real life within Cambridge. I visit. And you're lovely, you're charming, you're funny, you're sweet. What you are not is what the press presents young people as: puritanical, blacklisting, cancelling, woke maniacs. It is. It never ceases to amaze me, the gap between public perception and reality. And it is so depressing that these battle lines are drawn and these narratives that suit newspapers are continue to pertain. And they are very, very distressing and stupid. Because, one of my other writing heroes was P.G. Wodehouse. And he claimed that when he was in London, he would write letters and stamp them and put them in an envelope and throw them out of the window. Because he reasoned that most people were totally decent, and if they saw a stamped and addressed envelope in the street, they would pick it up and post it. And he claimed he never had a letter go astray that way. As he said, if you throw a brick into the middle of Leicester Square, it will bean a very decent person. And that is my view. I do think most people are not, well, here are we, children lost in a wood, I'm trying to remember the W.H. Auden, who try to be happy and try to be good. And of course, it's a big philosophical question, is can you be good if you aren't happy, and can you be happy if you aren't good? But most people, even if they act appallingly inside, are desperate to be happy and good. And so much in our society stops us being happy and good, or stops us having the confidence to be happy and good. And I suppose the great wonder of this island of 3 years or 4 years or however long your undergraduate or your time here might be, is that it offers you an opportunity to experiment with different ways of being happy and good. You experiment with alcohol, you experiment with friendship, you experiment with sex, you experiment with identity and with dress and with clothing. You reinvent yourself, you can change your name, you can change the way you think and act, and you can inspect yourself, honestly. And that's a marvelous thing to do, to inspect oneself and to wag a finger at oneself and to doubt one's own motives and say, oh, Stephen, you're just being that's what you greedily want, and you're pretending it's a moral and ethical thing, but it's really greed or whatever. Or just recognize the things in oneself. That's more important than going to lectures. It's more important than getting a good degree. Is the pleasure of that journey of self-examination and fun, I suppose. And I hope that will never change. Yeah.
The moral burden of picking last question is almost too much to bear. Do you want to do it? Or shall I?
Oh, that's very... Well, maybe I will, because I don't want to disappoint anyone whose hands are up by picking someone whose hand isn't up. So I will just finish by saying, if you can put your hands down, I'm sorry about that. And I want to return to Oscar again, because there are two things about him that almost make me cry. Well, one of them really did. I'll end with that, maybe. But the other is to remember that even if you're not going to witness history vindicating yourself or people you admire, it matters to know that history will. So Oscar, when he died in 1900, died in exile in Paris, having been in prison, having been put to 2 years hard labor, ill, unhappy. He would sit in hotels, and the English couples and families would come to the hotel, recognize him there, complain to the manager, who would throw him out into the street. He was publicly humiliated all the time. He had every reason to believe that his name would be associated with crime and shame and perversion for all time, because the Victorian morality seemed so permanent and so huge. And then something remarkable happened. And it reminds me of, if you've ever been to New York City, you can travel down Fifth Avenue, which goes downtown. This is going to sound like, what kind of metaphor is this? But it is a strange thing, and it's a very fun trick to do. If you get a good set of green lights in New York, and they go green, 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 and you're in the back of a cab, or an Uber, or whatever it might be, and you look out sort of out of the rear window as you pass 34th Street, you're passing the Empire State Building, which for many years was the tallest building in the world, and still one of the tallest buildings in Manhattan, and a great sight. But it's got buildings close to it, so it may be very tall, but the little building nearer it, you're low down, it seems it blocks it. So a little thing can block a big thing, can't it, when you're close to it? But if you've got this run of green, as you go down towards Union Square, Herald Square, whatever, you look out the back window, and this magical thing happens. This almost like an optical illusion, except the reality is that the Empire State Building, it's like a Saturn V rocket, just seems to go up and 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 higher and higher and higher, and all the smaller buildings shrink and shrink and shrink, because you now see it, and it's a wonderful thing. That's what happened throughout the 20th century to Oscar. Having been the most hated and reviled man in Europe, all the pygmies who were so much bigger than him when he died fell away, and his reputation went up and up and up and up. And he is now, to some extent, the patron saint of all artists and bohemians, not just a gay icon and an Irish icon, but an icon for all students. He's the student prince. When I first sort of started to be on television, things I would get invited to colleges and universities, and I would sometimes be asked to drink in the students' room or whatever. And in the early days, the posters on the wall would be of Karl Marx and John Lennon or Jimi Hendrix, because the world, if it was going to be saved, would be saved by revolution, political revolution, or by rock and roll music. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the continued crass commercialization in music and the various other things, somehow that didn't really play anymore. And I noticed that if you went to a student's room, the most likely figures you would see on the walls would be people like, Frida Kahlo or Einstein with his tongue out, or Oscar Wilde. Because if the world was going to be saved, it would be saved by the life of the mind. It would be saved by people like Oscar. And that made me so happy. And then the thing, this is why I always get very tearful. He died in Paris, as I said, and the great cemetery in Paris is Père Lachaise, where his tomb is. Jacob Epstein designed it. It's a beautiful Art Deco masterpiece of marble. And about a few years ago, the Irish government with the French Commune or arrondissement, whatever it was that it was responsible, pooled some money together to repair it. Why did it need repairing? Because the marble had corroded. And why had the marble corroded? Because so many people every day kissed it. And that made me so happy. There was this man, this giant man, who had been brought so low, and now he had towered up. And now people came and they stuck little post-it notes. Bless you, Oscar. I think of you every day. You died for me. And a kind of secular messiah almost. And that, to me, is a journey that humanity makes. And despite the hiccups along the way, and you stop at different traffic lights and another smaller building obscures the big one, the further you go, the true proportion of the things that matter shows itself. That's how I'd like to end. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. 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 Mwah. Darlings, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.